And you'll notice as we run through this passage, chapter 7 and chapter 8, why Deuteronomy works so well as a revival book. You know, when Josiah found the law within the temple and it changed the whole nation, it was the book of Deuteronomy. That's what transformed and got everybody back to following God. When Ezra reads the law in Nehemiah chapter 8 and verse 8, and it restores the people and puts a fervor within them, it's the book of Deuteronomy that he's reading. And one of the passages that he reads is not just the last 3 chapters of the book, which a lot of people focus on. It's this part right here, chapter 7 and chapter 8. So, and you'll notice as we go through it, man, the power that is in here and the things we're going to notice. Be looking for the passage, man shall not live by bread alone. You remember that in the New Testament, Matthew chapter 4? That's where this comes from, and we're going to see the context of why Jesus used that verse and what Jesus actually meant when he said it. You know, in the New Testament, Jesus, you know, when Satan says, make these rocks become bread, Jesus says, man should not live by bread alone. And we think, well, okay, that means it must have been a sin to turn stone to bread. Now, there's a context that's going on there. And so be looking for that as we go through here, and hopefully I will run across it and see. Now, as we get started, what you're going to notice is this is prep work. This is Moses getting Israel ready before they go into the promised land. And Moses realizes there's going to be some temptations. Temptation number 1 is they're going to want to be merciful when they shouldn't be merciful. They're going to go into Canaan, and they've got to kill all the men. They've got to kill all the women, all the children. A lot of times they have to kill all the livestock. And naturally, you would think, I'm not going to do that. That's not what good people do. And they forget that they're a judgment from God. That's what God promised would happen to these people if they would not repent. But there's going to be a temptation to save some of the gold off the idols. There's going to be a temptation to not kill everybody, but to turn everybody into slaves. There's going to be a temptation. And because of that, because they were more merciful than they should be, they caused themselves to run into trouble. And so that's the first thing you're going to notice as you run through here. Let me give you this if you want it. And so that's the first temptation, is to be more merciful. Temptation number 2 is comfort and leisure, okay? When you get there and you get into the land and you have every kind of food that you could ever want, everything turns out the way you want, you had the biggest house, you had the biggest garden, you're going to start thinking, I got here by myself. And look how smart I am, look at how good I am, look at how I'm better than everybody else. And in comfort, these people are going to forget God. And so that's temptation number 2. Temptation number 3 is kind of the opposite of that in a sense. When you get into this nation and realize, into the land of Canaan, realize all these people are powerful, you're going to realize you don't have the technology they have. You don't have those iron chariots that Sisera is going to have. You're going to get in there and realize those walls are bigger than anything you've ever seen at Jericho. Remember, it's God who's fighting, it's not you, and so therefore don't fear. So those 3 temptations are going to pop up over and over as we go through here in Deuteronomy chapter 7. So we get started. Let me just read the first 2 verses. Lord your God, when the Lord your God brings you in the land which you have possessed, he has cast out the nations before you, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, 7 nations greater and mightier than you. When you run across those, you just read them really fast, so it looks like you know what you're doing. And when the Lord God delivers them over to you, you shall conquer them and utterly destroy them. You cannot make a covenant with them or show mercy to them. You're not to make marriages with them. You're not to give them your daughter to their son or take their daughter for your son. Because, what's going to happen in verse 4? They're going to turn your sons away from following me to serve other gods, so the anger of the Lord will be aroused and destroy you suddenly. But you shall, verse 5, see, destroy their altars, knock down their sacred pillars, cut down their wooden images, and burn their carved images with fire. Why? Look there in verse 6. Why do you act this way? You are a holy people to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for himself, a special treasure above all peoples on the face of this earth. Now that's going to lead us into verse 7, but let's stop there in verse 6. You are a holy people. Some translations, older translations, say you are a peculiar people. A newer translation, if we were to take that word, would say you're weird. Now, what's one thing we don't want to be? Yeah, you don't want to be weird. You want to fit in, right? And there's always that temptation that's there. You got a question? What you got?
Well, I just want to make a comment. I like
Yeah.
the way the NIV translates that.
Yeah.
You are a people holy to the Lord.
You're a people holy to the Lord. The word there, holy, means to be separated, set apart. Yes, sir, Dan?
That word comes from pecuniary, which has to do with money and value.
Okay.
Purchased by God.
Yeah, pecuniary, which talks about something of value. In other words, we're purchased. You're not your own. You were bought with a price, as we'd read of in the New Testament. So that's a good comment as well. You're weird. And you look at the Jews in the Old Testament, they were weird. As an archaeologist, Dale Manor, who I think he may be retired from Harding now, but he taught over there for many years. I always liked reading his books or listening to his lectures. And he'd always talk about how if you're over in the Middle East and you're digging up an old city, you can find out in about 5 minutes whether it's an Israelite city or if it's not an Israelite city. And he said you find out by the way the houses are put together. You find out about what they have in their trash because there's no idols. And you can find out because it's the only place where there's not a lot of pork bones. The people there, we would say, loved barbecue. They ate pork like crazy. But if you're a Jew, you didn't. And so, sometimes in the New Testament, or not, sometimes today, we say, well, why did God not have them eat pork? And we'll say, well, it's because, you couldn't tell if it was cooked well enough or whatever. No. God just had certain rules to show his people were different. And that was one of the rules that he chose to show that they were different. It wasn't really a health issue necessarily, but it was a different thing. Now today as Christians, we're different. Now you don't see it in our dietary practice, but you need to see it in our marriages. You need to see it in our daily words. You need to see it in our living and how we treat one another. By this all men will know you're my disciples, that you love one another, right? We are weird. But man, there's this issue to conform, and we just want to conform to the world. And we want to look just like everybody else and act just like everybody else. And that was the temptation for Israel as well. They wanted a king. They wanted to be just like everybody else all the time. And so they're a holy people. Now, notice this idea of being a holy people. Start with me in verse 7. Chapter 7, verse 7. The Lord didn't set his love on you because you were more in number than anybody else, because you're the least of all the peoples. The Lord loves you, and because he keeps his oath that he swore to your fathers, and the Lord brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of bondage, from Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Israel wasn't Israel because they were a mighty nation, or because they were smart, or because they were big, or because they were rich. As a matter of fact, they were just a band of slaves hanging out in Egypt. A nation a group of families really, which would have just disappeared into obscurity as they were worked to death. That was what was happening to those people working for Egypt. God took them and brought them out, not because they were good, not because they had done everything right, but because of the promise he had made to their fathers. He had told Abraham, I want to make you a great nation. And he said the same thing to Isaac and Jacob. Now, why was it important for Israel to remember this, that they weren't chosen because of their goodness or their power? They glorify God. What'd you say, Brad? They had to know who's in control, okay? Because a lot of times when life works well, we think we did it. And many times when Israel was on top of the world, in the days of Solomon, in the days of Josiah, in the days of many of these other kings, they thought, hey, we're better than everybody else. And they oftentimes had that opinion and they had that thought because they forgot from whence they had come. They forgot what they used to be. And that was an important thing for them always to remember. They had to remember that so much. And so, verse 9, therefore know the Lord your God, he is God. the faithful God who keeps covenant and mercy for 1,000 generations to those who love him and keep his commandments. And he repays those who hate him to their face to destroy them. He will not be slack with them who hates him, but he will repay him to his face. Therefore, verse 11, you shall keep the commandment, the statute, and the judgment, which I command you to observe them. So God is telling him, I have blessed you when you don't deserve it, but when you turn away from me, you're going to be judged. And that really, in many ways, is the story of the nation of Israel, isn't it? God takes care of his people, but his people need to remain faithful. His people need to stay faithful to him at all times. So what's going to happen? Check this out in verse 12, and I love it. Verse 12, your life is going to be good. It comes to pass, because you have listened to these judgments and keep them and do them, the Lord your God will keep the covenant with the mercy which he swore to your fathers, and he will love you and bless you and multiply you, and he will bless the fruit of your womb and the fruit of your land and your grain and your new wine and your oil and the increase of your cattle and the offspring of your flock and the land in which he swore your fathers to give you. Verse 14, you're going to be blessed more than anyone else. See that? You're going to be blessed above all peoples, and there will be nobody barren among you. The Lord's going to take away, verse 15, the Lord take away from you all sickness and will afflict you with none of these terrible diseases of Egypt, which you have known, which will lay on them because of those who hate you. And you shall destroy all the peoples whom the Lord your God delivers to you, and your eye shall have no pity on them, nor shall you serve their gods, for that will be a snare. Now, verse 15 rings with me because in the culture and the context in which I was raised. Does the word or the phrase, none of these diseases, does that ring a bell with you? It's a book. Woohoo! Yes. Rhonda and I love books. And we are all about books. I used to say it was in the library, and then I would say it was in the library. It's probably not in the library anymore. But book came out 1920. Edward, I don't remember what the guy's last name was. But he goes through the Old Testament laws, a lot of the dietary laws, a lot of the Leviticus 13 talking about containment or, keeping sick people away, quarantine. And he goes through and he talks about how if you follow those laws, it actually makes you much more healthy. You know, if you follow more of a vegetable diet than a pork diet, if you follow a lot of these things. And so as he goes through, he's a doctor and he does a lot of medical diagnoses as he goes through there. And the name of that book is None of These Diseases. And pretty much every church library, which still exists, if there are any that exist, has that book. And you probably have that book at home. If you look in the old church, if you look up there, next to the commentaries or whatever. But when I ran across that studying this week, I was like, oh, None of These Diseases. I remember that book. But that's where he got the title, which was there. And so what's he say? If you're faithful, what's going to happen to you? You're going to prosper. You're going to have some babies. And you're going to have some puppies and kittens. No, not puppies and kittens. But your flocks, they're going to have all sorts of extra flocks. Every time you plant something, it's just going to go great. You're going to have so much stuff you can't even contain it. Life will be wonderful. Now, that's not true of every individual, but as a nation, that is true of the people who lived in this area. Now, if you look at pictures of Israel, especially living here in Western Kentucky, if you look at pictures in Israel, it does not look like the land of milk and honey to me. When I was a kid growing up in these little children's classes, I thought Israel must look like the Amazon rainforest because everything I always read about how everything would be so productive. Why is Israel called the land of milk and honey? Why was it such a wonderful, they talk about the fertility there. Does anybody know?
God blessed it.
Well, God blessed it, yeah. But it's drier than it is here. Israel would be a long ways to walk to get to here, though. Primarily, the reason is there's two growing seasons. The winters are very mild. There's two growing seasons. And so if you're a farmer, if you have two crops a year, life is pretty good. And everything else that goes along with that, you can double your produce, especially in that period of the world. And we'll get to later the geography and the geology of what's going on in Israel. We'll get to that later. So as you go down to verse 16, if you follow God, life is going to be great. Look at verse 17. But if you say in your heart, these nations are greater than I, how can I dispossess them? You shall not be afraid of them, but you shall remember well the Lord your God, what he did to Pharaoh and all of Egypt. The trials which your eyes saw, the signs and wonders, the mighty hand, the outstretched arm by which the Lord brought you out. So the Lord your God will do to all the peoples of whom you are afraid. Moreover, your God will send a hornet among them until those who are left, who hide themselves from you, are destroyed. You shall not be terrified of them, for the Lord your God, the great and awesome God, is among you. Verse 22, your God shall drive them out, the nations before you, little by little. You will be unable to destroy them at once, lest the beasts of the field become too numerous of you. But the Lord your God will deliver them over to you and will inflict defeat upon them until they are destroyed. He will deliver their kings to your hand. You will destroy their name from under heaven. No one shall be able to stand before you until you have destroyed them. And of course, they're going to burn the idols and they're going to do all these things, but we'll get to that. And so God says, hey, you're going to go against Sisera and his 900 iron chariots. If you recall, you were working through Joshua. You're going to go against Jericho and this huge wall here. You're going to go against a lot of these people who, the Southern Coalition, which is he's going to fight later in the book of Joshua. And he said, if you're standing there ready for battle, you're going to be scared. Don't be scared. When you get there, you realize it's not you that's fighting, it's God. Did David beat Goliath because he was better with the slingshot than anybody else? Why did David beat Goliath? God was with him. The battle belongs to God. Okay? That's the reason. And like we said in the sermon today, Joshua didn't have a better trumpet. Gideon didn't have a better trumpet. They're just following God, right? And that's the way it is. Now today, in our spiritual battle and even in our physical battle, there's some forces you're going to face, and they look pretty big and pretty mean. Who's fighting? God. Let God fight the battle. And you'll notice as you go through the book of Joshua, I remember teaching that in a class one time, and I made a chart of all the ways God wins the battle. A lot of times he likes to bring hailstones and storms. Sometimes he'll open up the earth and swallow people. This one is referenced, happens twice in the book of Joshua. Before Israel even got there, hornets or other evil things will come and strike everybody and kill the people. And then Israel marches in, and what do you know? There's no battle. Everybody's already dead. You just mop up whatever's left. God says, when you face those battles, don't be scared like your ancestors. Realize I'm going to do it for you. Now, God says, I'm not going to kill them all at once. Now, why is that? You leave a place empty for very long, what happens? Wild animals, it grows up. It gets where it's difficult to live there anymore. And especially back then when you had bears who lived there, lions who lived there, you didn't want them to get used to being around your house. And so God says, I'm going to let them stay and let you slowly invade, and that way you're able to handle the home pretty well. Now, how does that relate to today? Why doesn't God fix your problem like that in an instant? I used to be able to snap there. I was able to snap eventually. Why didn't God fix your problem immediately? And make your life where you never have an issue? What you got, Mike? Okay, you gain strength by overcoming obstacles, overcoming those things that come along there. Okay, yeah, absolutely. If every battle that you're ever going to face was already won, and you went to church, you went home, went to work, but never really had a problem, what kind of Christian would you be? Well, he would say we'd be a good Christian, but it would be difficult. It'd be difficult to grow in faith. It'd be difficult not to grow in pride. And so God allows us to grow incrementally. And I'm not even sure that's a word, but if it was, it'd be a good one.
Also, if we didn't have any problems, we wouldn't know that he could solve them.
If we didn't have problems, we wouldn't know he could solve them. Right, yeah. That's a good point. Good thing to say there. And so a very good thing for us to notice. Okay? And so God says, I'm going to win your battles, but it's going to take time. It's going to take your participation. It's going to take your work to be involved in that as well. And so that's something you're going to have to know. Now, verse 25, here's the danger again. You got to burn the idols. You can't covet the gold that's on them. Otherwise, you'll be snared by it. It's an abomination to the Lord your God. Nor shall you bring an abomination into your house, lest you be doomed to destruction like it. Remember the fellow named Achan? Okay, that's in Joshua as well. You shall detest it and abhor it. It is an accursed thing. One of the greatest dangers that can happen to you as a Christian is for you not to hate sin. You've got to learn to hate sin. You've got to realize what it can do to you. Many years ago, I was talking to a preacher. Many years ago, I was working on doing a gospel meeting, and I asked that church, okay, what sermons do you want to hear? And one of the things they wanted to hear was, how little can I do and still get to heaven? And usually we're not open enough to ask that. But how little can I do and still get to heaven? And when I was talking to them about it, they said, well, we want to know. And they said, it's not for me, it's for a friend, of course. But we want to know, okay, if I just go on Sunday morning, can I still go to heaven? Okay. If I just go to church once a month, can I still make it to heaven? If I drink alcohol but I never get drunk, can I still go to heaven? I remember the teenage boy who said this, if I flirt with somebody and if how far can I go before that gets me to where I don't go to heaven? And most of us are too prideful to actually ask a preacher that question. But how many of us live that way? How much can I do, or how little can I do, and God's not going to zap me? And we want to get as close as we can to that edge. And that's what the warning is here. You don't even let an idol into your house. You don't even let yourself be in the presence of something like that, lest you learn to love it, lest you learn to be brought under the influence of it. And if you love God, you've got to hate sin. And you've got to be very careful, because when you begin to tolerate something, many times it'll grow in your life and it'll cause problems and cause issues which are there. And that's something pretty important for us to remember. All right, now chapter 8. 5 minutes, I can do this. Chapter 8. Every command that I give you, you need to, the original language says stare at. You need to observe, to look intently at it. You need to be careful, because when you obey it, you'll multiply, you'll possess the land, and you shall remember the Lord your God led you these 40 years through the wilderness. Why? To humble, to test, to know what was in your heart, and whether or not you're going to be able to keep his commandments. The reason why you've endured what you've endured is God is seeing what kind of people you are before he gives you these blessings. What would you do with this? They talk about, yes, ma'am, Dave.
I want to make an observation.
Very good.
What was coming with Christ, I don't think they'd be complaining now about what they're going through, because it's nothing compared to what he goes through later on.
Right. Compared to what Christ has,
Right.
what they're going through is nothing.
Nothing.
Yeah. But in their perspective, it was a lot. Yeah. And we're going to run through here and look at some of these things. Look here in verse 3, okay? All right. And this is the word, what I was talking about, okay? Matthew 4 is about to ring through here. Verse 3, he humbled you. He let you hunger. He let you starve. He fed you with manna, which you didn't know and your fathers had never seen, that you might make you know that man shall not live by bread alone, but lives by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Okay, see that out of Matthew 4? All right, God puts you in the wilderness where, almost 1 million Jews, there's no place to find water. There's no place to make food. You can't grow food in the wilderness, especially if you're traveling. There's not enough flocks that you can have with you, butcher every day. And so the people are going to starve naturally. God gave you food that you had never heard of. Manna, which floats down from heaven and shows up in the morning on the ground, which is kind of gross. Stuff you had never heard of, he fed you. He did all this to let you know that man does not live by bread alone, but by the word of God. So what does that phrase mean? Man doesn't live by bread alone, but by the word of God. What's that phrase mean?
To be whole and complete, you've got to be spiritual.
Good to be whole and complete, you got to be spiritually complete. Yeah. God's not going to let your life make sense. Yeah, you've seen that by observation. God is not going to let your life make sense. He's going to make it where you have to learn to trust him. Now, for some of us, our life makes sense better than others. But God let them get hungry. God let them suffer. Now, the next verse, their clothes didn't wear out. He took care of them. But there are times where they approach things in life, and it was not good, because he says, before I get you in that promised land, I want you to recognize you need me. And life does not make sense without God. Because, we'll read this later in the chapter, even though I'm running out of time, because when they get into the land, they're going to say, and there's a listing. You're going to have wheat, you're going to have barley, you're going to have pomegranates, you're going to have olives, you're going to have grapes, you're going to have figs. You know, it's like going into the buffet. And he said, you're going to go from manna, that's all you ever had, to every meat and every vegetable you can imagine. And he said, and when you get there, you're going to forget who God is. You've got to remember, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word of God. And you've got to trust that and know that as it's there. Verse 5, now this is going to ring in Hebrews to you, right? The Lord chastens those whom he loves. You should know in your heart that as a man chastens his son, so also the Lord your God will chasten you. Therefore, verse 6, keep his commandments, because God's bringing you to a good land. Not only do you get all those things, verse 9, you're going to get copper and iron. Now, if you're a Hebrew, you'd go, what is that?